You are such a genuine gem. Thank you for clicking on my video. I'm Brooke McKenna, but today's case is the Preppy murder. Hookup gone wrong or killer date? Now, this was a murder in the wealthy neighborhoods of New York City where a boy and a girl went for an evening out and it ended with a death. However, one person was called a victim and it wasn't the one who lost their life. By the way, it is my absolute passion to tell these stories, and I mean no harm or disrespect when I do so. So if it's something that you would like to support me in doing, all you have to do is make sure you are subscribed with the post notification bell on, give this a thumbs up, and leave a nice comment down below. By the way, I want to give a huge thank you to the sources that helped me find the information for this case, and that is Once Upon a Crime Podcast, True Crime Brewery Podcast, Special Report, The Preppy Killer, Town and Country Mag, Good Housekeeping, Juicy Scoop with Heather McDonald, and 48 Hours. Now let's get back to the story. So it was 1986 in New York, and Jennifer Dawn Levin lived in Soho. She was 18 years old at this time. She was a beautiful teenager, a class clown, and quite the dreamer. Her father was actually a real estate agent who had bought property in Soho, and she had just moved in with him after not really getting along with her mother. They were divorced at this time, and so she decided, after having so many teenage arguments with her mother, she was just going to head over and spend some time with her father. Now, this meant she went from where she was living in Long Island and going to school with those type of kids to moving to Soho, which at this time wasn't the, wealthiest part of New York City. In fact, it wasn't even up and coming. It was just kind of one of the lesser liked areas, and it was definitely cheaper. However, she would be going to school on the Upper East Side. It was quite the change for her. In fact, her father had actually gotten remarried, so she had a stepmother, and they didn't get along well either, but she was just trying to basically get through her last teenage year. She hadn't even gone to their wedding when they got married. But Jennifer was so playful and completely herself. And even back then, when she was moving to such a different area from where she'd grown up, she didn't live in the most extravagant, wealthy neighborhood. She didn't wear those clothes, and people knew that she wasn't like them, but they loved her because of who she was and her personality that just shined through everything she was doing. It was a breath of fresh air to her friends who were used to people who had grown up into wealth, and she really was the life of the party, constantly being invited to places just because they knew that they could count on her for a laugh or to make sure that the party was fun. And so she could genuinely put everyone in a better mood. The most important things in her life at this time were her friends, and they would even keep in contact during, natural disasters such as a hurricane that was happening during this time, and that's just how much they bonded. These people were her family, and they made her feel loved and respected. Not that her parents didn't, but of course teenagers have a harder time connecting with their parents, and they get into many more arguments. Her parents were great parents. They just butted heads, as teenagers do. She really bonded with her friends and hung out with them a lot more than being at home. Now, this was actually really nice for her because she kind of found the people who loved her how she was, because when she was a kid, she actually didn't get to hang out with a lot of her friends at their own homes because the parents simply couldn't put up with her. She was super hyperactive and they didn't know how to control her at all. This leads me to believe that possibly she had ADHD, which can cause difficulty in paying attention for long periods of time, as well as impulsiveness, and can kind of seem as though the child is doing it on purpose, like they are just not wanting to have good behavior, but in fact it's just that their mind moves so much faster than everybody else's, meaning that they move faster as well. But at this point, Jennifer was going to a small private school called Baldwin. And this was actually for people with learning disabilities, which is why I believe it could have been the ADHD that was, hindering her schooling, because it does make schooling quite difficult, but still doable. And so she was going to Baldwin, and all of her classmates claimed she was very easy to be around. They invited her to their expensive homes. Often they said she could borrow any of their clothes or anything that she wanted at all times, because of course they had mommy or daddy's credit card, and it didn't matter to them if this friend of theirs was taking stuff, because they could just get a replacement. And they knew that she didn't have that sort of income. Her family wasn't made of money. If you've ever watched the show Gossip Girl, this case really reminds me of that show. It was a whole bunch of teenagers who could basically just do whatever they wanted with their parents' money and didn't have many responsibilities that they had to attend to. In fact, their parents really didn't care what they did. And in this scenario, Jennifer was more like a Dan Humphrey, who came from a lesser wealthy family and had to work harder for what she obtained. While her friends were actually at the Hamptons going about their own summer, she got a job nearby so she could go and party with them afterwards and could still be close to them while also still making money. I really loved listening to Jennifer's life and what she did, because it really seemed to me like she was an outcast. She was completely different than those around her, but she didn't let that get her down. She didn't expect handouts or, pity from others. She worked hard, and she was going to make her own path in life regardless of where she came from. And I think that that's something that is so incredible and something to look up to in a person. Now, Jennifer was in heaven at their houses, not because she necessarily cared about this wealth or these huge houses, but it was more the clothing, because she wanted to be a designer and she didn't have access to all of the clothing that she wanted to be able to have. But with their clothes that she was borrowing, and her clothes, and the clothes that she bought on discount at the store that she was working at, she could put together outfits that she really enjoyed. And this made her so extremely happy, because, like I said, this was a passion of hers. This was something she wanted to go into as a career. Jennifer, like I said, wasn't the happiest with her home life, but she did spend a lot of time away from her family, and she was thriving when she did that. She had a fake ID by the time she was like 15. She was getting into some high-end fancy bars, and in fact one of those was called Dorian's, and this was one that she frequented, her and her friends, during the summer. During Jennifer's senior year of high school, she had this on-again, off-again boyfriend named Brock. They had a mutual understanding that they both weren't mature enough to actually commit to each other, so it was more of a hookup type thing, and they were okay with this. However, the year of 1986, before this summer, it was Valentine's Day of February 14th, and Jennifer would meet a different boy who was handsome and tall and was really eye-catching. If he walked into a room, all of the women turned to look, and she really had a crush on him. She met him at this birthday/Valentine's Day party, and he was a year older than her, and they talked for a little bit, but nothing really escalated from there, and she was really disappointed because she wanted something to happen with him. But throughout that year, through the summer, they would see each other a few more times, and this would further escalate to, different hookups and little dates. But it hadn't yet blossomed into a relationship. College was right around the corner at this point. That August, she would be headed to Boston to go to school, and she was really excited. And her friends were trying to, make the most of their time with her and the end of their summer, so they were going to these different bars a ton during this time, especially to Dorian's. And so on August 25th, that's exactly what they were doing. They headed out to dinner, and then they went to Dorian's Red Hand Bar on the Upper East Side, and there were so many people there just trying to bask in the freedom that their teen years could give them. Everyone was having so much fun. However, none of her friends would leave with her that night, and this would lead to an incredible amount of guilt on their end that none of them could have expected to feel. I mean, one of her friends left with her boyfriend around 2 a.m. and Jennifer asked her to leave the spare key under the mat, like the doormat, so she could get in whenever she went home. And so they really expected her to just walk in the doors that early morning and to be there the next day. But she wouldn't be. You see, the rest of her friends continued partying, whether at that bar or at a different bar. They just weren't always with each other. So they would go off and do their own little things. And, that next morning, they would have no idea that their beloved Jennifer had been found. And this was by a cyclist at Central Park as the sun came up. And she hadn't just passed out from being too drunk. There was a citizen who was riding their bike through the park going near 5th Avenue and 83rd Street behind the Metropolitan Museum of Art when he saw a half-naked body lying in the grass. This was only a few blocks away from Dorian's, and when the police arrived, because of course he ran to the nearest phone and called them, they found that the body was covered in bite marks and her shirt was pushed up to her neck as well as her bra. Her skirt was up around her waist and she wasn't wearing any underwear. There were cuts and bruises on her face and her neck, and her underwear was actually found 50 yards away from her body, but the autopsy showed that her cause of death was strangulation that had been done over 20 to 30 seconds. It was also found that the cuts on her neck were found from her own fingernails, as though she was trying to claw off the person who had their hands on her neck. And her eye was also swollen shut. Now, of course, New York is a huge place, and there are so many people that it could have taken quite a long time for the identification process to happen. However, they found a key card in her pocket, which was for a certain apartment building, and they went to this apartment building, and the doorman immediately said, "Yeah, I know that girl. She's actually staying with one of our tenants." And so this tenant was talked to, and this friend identified her as Jennifer. No one wanted to believe that something so horrific could happen to this young girl in such a short span of time. And her rings, as well as her earrings and her money, was all gone except for one ripped dollar bill at the scene. And that is when investigators had to inform her parents as well, who lived, of course, in Soho as well as on Long Island. And they had no idea when they answered the phone that morning what they were going to be told. And I guarantee you they didn't expect or wouldn't have ever wished for that to be what they were told. Once her friends heard that this crime scene had occurred and it involved someone that they knew so well, they were all willing to talk. They were coming forward to investigators, wanting to tell them what all they knew about the night prior. And up until now, investigators really believed that this was some sort of random sexual assault that ended in murder, whether that was accidental or not. But this was because she was found naked and also spread eagle, as though this killer wanted to humiliate this victim. And then they talked to her friends, and they had a different theory afterwards, because many of Jennifer's friends had seen Jennifer leave this bar around 4:30 a.m., and she wasn't alone. She was with a man named Robert Chambers. They had been talking at the bar that night. They seemed to be getting along well, and they left together in a great mood. However, when Jennifer's friend, who she was, staying with at the time, who identified her, found out that Jennifer was found, she immediately called Robert, knowing that they had left together, and asked him if he saw her that night or, what had happened. And Robert immediately told her that he didn't leave the bar with her, and that she was going to her ex's, Brock's, instead. And Jennifer's friend knew he was lying, because Brock wasn't even in New York City at this time. She wouldn't have been just going to see him, because it wasn't that easy of a trip. So immediately they knew that something was fishy. With Robert being the last person to possibly see Jennifer alive, they immediately went to interrogate him in his apartment at 2 p.m. that day. When they went in, to talk to him, they found that he had scratches all over his face and his neck. And of course, this was extremely telling. Robert told his mother that he was just going to help investigators with whatever they needed, and then he was taken down to the station to be questioned for the next 8 hours, where more scratches were found further down his chest. And he said that he was with her that night, and then he told them a different story than he had told Jennifer's friend, that he did take her to Central Park on a walk. They were just going to talk, and that was one of his favorite places to go. He said she was talking about college and flirting with him, asking him to come visit her, and he was very open about the fact that he wasn't going to go visit her because he didn't see a future with her. He didn't want to be with her on a relationship level. He stated very firmly that nothing more was going to happen between the two of them, and that's when Robert said Jennifer got extremely angry and attacked him, scratching him all over his face. And when he got away, he went to sit under a tree in the grass. That's when he said Jennifer walked over once again and then wanted to have sex with him. Robert would then go into detail about what he said Jennifer did to him, saying that he was tied, his hands were tied together behind his back with her underwear. He was pushed backwards, and she started touching him and his genitals sexually. And he said that he told her that she was hurting him and he wouldn't stop. So he freed his hands and he basically grabbed her neck from behind, pulled her off, and pushed her to the ground beside him. And that's when he told her, "Let's go, we need to go." And he said he looked back and she was no longer breathing. He said she wanted to have rough sex with him and that it ended badly simply because that's what Jennifer wanted. When they asked him why he didn't go and get help when he found out she wasn't breathing, he said he was simply in shock. And I think hearing this actual confession, if that's what you want to call it, from him is so beneficial, so I will play it right now.
She said I looked really cute and that I would look cuter tied up. And I thought, she was just horsing around. She wrapped her underwear around my wrists so they were locked and they were behind my back because I was leaning on my hands. And she just pushed me back like this and then got on top of my chest. She was laughing and giggling and making weird kind of laughing type of sounds while digging her nails into me. And this really hurt, and I couldn't take it anymore, and I was screaming in pain.
Chambers got up on a desk to show how he broke free and struck the fatal blow.
So I reached up like this and grabbed, and I came down like that on my hand. She's flipping backwards. She came over this way and landed right there, right next to the tree. So I stood up, and I pulled up my pants, and I said, "Jennifer, let's go. Let's get out of here now." And she didn't move.
He also said that the police were clearing the area that morning and that they told him to go home. No injuries were seen on his genitalia. It was checked out, and he was also a foot taller than Jennifer, and he weighed double the amount. And yet he was saying that the only way to get Jennifer off of him was basically to kill her. Upon all of this information being released to the public, more witnesses came forward. And this time it was a doctor who was jogging through the area early that morning. It was around 5 a.m. when he saw a couple in the grass and he heard a man cry out in pain. Since he was a doctor, he asked this man if he was okay, and the man said yes. So he went on. Another jogger said that they saw a man sitting near a stone wall nearby the crime scene when the police started showing up, and he was just watching, and he also had scratches all over his face. So this was basically saying that Robert was watching as his victim was found. Now his maid also found a shirt that was covered in blood and dirt after that night. But if he simply pulled her off of him and somehow was so aggressive that he killed her, this still didn't explain the bruises on the front of her neck and the bite marks all over her body. So now's the time to tell you a little bit more about Mr. Robert Chambers. You see, he was born to an average family, and he was a single child to an accountant father and a private nurse for a mother. It actually helped pregnant women give birth. She was basically a midwife, and so coming to the States, she was really, knowledgeable about different things and was getting some good jobs as a private nurse. And when she met his father and she got pregnant, she took some time off to work with him while his father still worked as an accountant. They worked really hard to make their money and to send him to these prestigious private Catholic schools. And from the very beginning, when he was little, he was quite social. He was athletic, and even at 3 years old, he was shaking people's hands, introducing himself, and just being this very well-mannered child. But quickly his behavior started changing, and his father, as he grew up, was kind of dealing with alcohol addiction and was going to in and out of rehab, and so his mother was kind of a single mother at this point, trying to provide for him. And at school, teachers said that they noticed that Robert didn't ever make any friends, and he never cried at all. Even when he broke his collarbone, he simply said nothing until somebody asked him about it. By the time he was 8, he was put into a military boot camp, or, not really a military, it was like a knockoff military boot camp, where it was like a rich children's Boy Scouts program. And apparently rich people of the area sent their sons to these all the time. And so Robert's mother really wanted him to make friends and feel involved with his peers, so she sent him to this. And Robert did become popular, but at this point, he also got into the wrong type of crowd, and by the time he was 10, he was getting drunk and smoking weed. And he would also get into fights while under the influence, and eventually he was staying up all night, drinking and partying, and missing school the next day, and so his grades eventually began to slip. Since this was a prestigious private school, he was kicked out, and his parents had to work even harder to get him into different private schools or boarding schools, and the same things just kept happening because Robert didn't care about his schooling at all. Robert didn't think he needed this schooling, and in fact, he had found a new way to earn money for himself. But that involved stealing from his rich friends and their families, and every time he was invited to a party, instead of socializing or making friends, he would go ransack their homes and steal anything he could. He would also go through the guests' coat pockets as well as purses, and eventually all of his classmates knew he was doing this and just continued to invite him and hid their stuff before he came. But he was so handsome, and so the girls still loved him. And they wanted him to come to these parties. They wanted to get a chance to flirt with him or be his girlfriend. And they just started being more careful about leaving their items unattended. But Robert didn't necessarily like his classmates. He went for girls who were much younger than him. In high school, that was girls in middle school. Eventually in college, that was girls in high school. And no matter what girl it was, he never really cared about commitment or being exclusive with them. He basically ignored them until they would dump him because they were sick of it, and then he would suddenly need their attention and beg them for it. Robert and his mother, around this time, then when he was in high school, moved to a nicer apartment in Manhattan while his father was in rehab once again. She was still working as a private nurse. It was for really good clients, the rich, the wealthy. But it was speculated that she, in fact, was also stealing to be able to afford that nice of an apartment in Manhattan. I mean, this could have been where Robert was learning to steal from, but this is just speculation, and Robert then, in his new school, stole a teacher's purse and was expelled for this. He showed no remorse for what he had done, and then he was sent to rehab as well because his mother feared he had stolen this money to buy drugs. This wasn't really the case. I mean, sometimes it was, but he also just liked stealing. And so he went to a different private school once he got out, and he also had to get a job to keep him busy. But of course, this didn't end up working out. It didn't stop his ways, and he wasn't doing his schoolwork. So they eventually had to put him in detention at school to get him to do some of his work, but this still wasn't doing enough to make him graduate on time. Although they did let him graduate with his class, they just had an empty diploma given to him, and he had to go back for summer school. Even though he was supposed to be maturing, it really didn't seem like he was learning anything, and this was thought to be because he never truly had any consequences for what he was doing. His friends in high school who saw all this stealing did nothing, so he felt like he could get away with it. Then he started working after high school, and he continued getting fired because he was stealing from them. But by some sort of miracle, he got into Boston University. And he traveled there, and he failed after one semester and headed back to New York. Now, this is when the cocaine use was said to begin, and to make money for his drug use, he was sleeping with different women where he would keep the door unlocked, and his friends would come in and steal a whole bunch of stuff from the house while he was having sex with these women. And he also stole a friend's parents' credit card and used like $3,000 on random different things, but he was actually caught by his friend and his parents, and they once again didn't force him to have any consequences. They said that they didn't want to embarrass Robert or the Chambers family and just told him to pay it back. So he got away with it like he always did. He often went to the bars, of course, and Dorian's was one of his favorites to go to because the owner's son was actually someone he went to high school with, and he felt like he couldn't get in trouble there, no matter what he did. He was even handed a summons by the police for disorderly conduct one night there, but he refused to take it, and when they forced him to, he ripped it up and screamed, "You effing cowards, you should stick to N-word." Except he used the real word. And on the night of August 25th, Robert was at that very bar when one of his girlfriends walked up to him and threw a bag of condoms at his face, telling him he could use it with somebody else because he wasn't going to be using them with her. Now, like I said, Jennifer was at that very bar, and she laughed with everybody else. And after that, she went over to talk to him. When Robert was arrested, he got to see his father for a brief moment. He hugged him, and then he was overheard telling him, "That effing bee, why didn't she leave me alone?" Now, of course, Robert was going to be given the best lawyer possible, the best lawyer money could buy. And the Archbishop of Newark of New Jersey wrote a letter in support of Robert, saying that he was a great kid and that he should be released on bail. Now, this archbishop knew them because Robert's mother was once his nurse, but he didn't really know Robert. However, Jack Dorian, the owner of Dorian's Bar, put up his townhouse as collateral for the $150,000 bail, so Robert could get out before his trial. The trial was huge in the media because no one wanted to believe that this seemingly perfect, handsome young man could be a killer. And so that's when the victim blaming began. All the headlines were about rough sex and Jennifer's sexual activities and who she was. Now, reporters were outside of Robert's apartment every single day before the trial, and his mother actually escaped at one point to see friends, and those friends would say that all Robert's mother was talking about was that it was a horrible accident, and she was talking to them because they were wealthy, and she needed their help with money to pay for the lawyer's expenses, and they gave it to her. When he was out on bail, he actually attended a party that was put on by some of Jennifer's female classmates, and they invited Robert. And they actually recorded some of this party, and this was released to the public and shown at court. And it would show Robert playing with a Barbie doll before popping off its head and saying, "Oops, I think I killed her." And then everybody who knew Jennifer began to laugh. This is how much control that Robert had over people. Without even them knowing that they were being manipulated, they were laughing at a joke about a murder victim from the killer himself. Now, he was indicted on 2 counts of second-degree murder, and the trial began on January 3rd of 1988. The defense was that it was in self-defense in regards to sex. Now, I want to let you hear a statement made from Robert himself.
I regret that nothing I can say or do can undo the terrible tragedy that has occurred. I am happy to be out of jail and very grateful for the support of my family, relatives, and friends.
The public seemed to be almost siding with Robert, especially girls, saying that there was nothing to be done for Jennifer, but they could still save Robert. Jennifer's reputation was scrutinized, saying that she was wild, she was drunk, she was sexual, and that she was basically asking for it. And they even went so far as to describe what she was wearing, the miniskirt that night, and how much she had to drink, and just the typical awful things that don't matter at all. And they said that the bites on her body must have been from the other men that she was sleeping with, and that she also had a sex diary, when in fact this was literally numbers of her friends and family and crushes. Her mother said that every time she read the newspaper, she felt like she was burying Jennifer again because she was being murdered in the media. On the other hand, media was referring to Robert as the Preppy Killer. They gave him this description of an innocent schoolboy who wore polo and khakis and couldn't do any harm. He couldn't hurt a fly. And so this is how the public saw this case. So, would he get away with murder just like he had gotten away with all of his wrongdoings before? Well, psychologists said that Robert had the same personality as Ted Bundy. And I think this shows in a statement that he made at court.
I never wished any of this to happen. I never wanted any of this to happen. But her name will live on, not through memories, but by her family and her feelings. And I wish to apologize to the family and to her friends for all the trouble that they've gone through. I've never wanted any of this to happen to anybody.
There were 40 statements brought to this trial testifying for Robert's good behavior, and so ultimately the jury took this into consideration, and after 9 days of being at deadlock, they would enter a plea deal, and Robert would plead guilty, and he also had to admit that he killed her intentionally in court. Now, he was asked if he caused intentional physical harm to Jennifer, and he said, looking back, I'd have to say yes, but in my heart. And then he just stopped, and the judge said, we need more than that, and asked him the same question again, to which Robert finally responded, yes, Your Honor. However, this meant he was only charged with manslaughter in the first degree and would be sentenced to 5 to 15 years in prison. While he was in prison, due to bad behavior and disciplinary violations while serving his sentence, he was kept for the entire 15 years, even though that was nothing, and he served 4 of those years in solitary confinement. Although after that, he was released in 2003. Robert was still saying at that point that it was an accident, and he moved to Georgia with a girl that he had been dating since before he was in prison. And that was his girlfriend, Shawn Koval. Now, this wasn't the same girl who threw the condoms at him. This was actually a girl that, while he was being accused of murder, came into his life. And she was actually a girl in the tape where he popped off the Barbie doll's head. So this was a completely different girl. During this time that he was released, Jennifer's parents were actually suing Dorian's the Bar for serving too much alcohol to Robert, but this was ultimately settled. I'm not sure for how much or anything further, but Robert was also given a wrongful death lawsuit forcing him to pay the family of Jennifer's money that he would receive from any, book or movie deals, up to $25 million. Robert often talked about if there was going to be a movie about him and said that he wanted Rob Lowe to play him. The family said that any money they would make from anything that was made off of this case would go to victims' rights organizations. Nothing would be kept for them. Now, Robert was actually interviewed only one time after his release because that's the only interview he wanted to do. And he would basically say that if he was a monster, he wouldn't care. but he did care, and he thought about Jennifer every day. He talked about choking the doll, popping her head off on the videotapes, said he was just messing around with friends, and that he now takes responsibility for what he did, and that he never intended to harm anyone, and that he wasn't even going to go out to the bars that night. He had no plan to do anything. Now, in every interview and every tape recording I've seen of Robert, he's really good at making you feel like he's the victim, just like how the media portrayed him, how he was dealing with the guilt and the pain after killing someone. But nobody cared about the victim herself. This is exactly what Robert wants. He wants you to forget what he did and feel bad for him. And the real question that we've never gotten the answer to is why? What was the motive here to make him kill her? 5 years later, Robert was back in custody. He was driving with a suspended license, and they found heroin in his car, and he was jailed for 100 days. He was released, but only 2 years later in 2007 would be arrested again. This time it was for selling drugs with his girlfriend Sean from their apartment, and Robert pleaded guilty and was given 19 years in prison. Sean pleaded guilty as well and got a lesser sentence, but what baffles me the most is that he got more for selling drugs than for murdering, for taking a girl's life. He also resisted arrest at this point, but he could be released on January 25th of 2024 from the Sullivan's Correctional Facility. Unfortunately, this case didn't bring anything really decent to the criminal justice system. In fact, it did the opposite, because it's the reasons that trials have begun to blame the victim for some of these violent crimes done to them. And I think it just makes it seem okay to the media to do the same. This case is horrific for more reasons than just her death. Because her mother was right. She did get murdered over and over again, every time somebody slandered her name. Now, do you remember the Archbishop that I was telling you about of Newark, New Jersey, that talked about Robert and how wonderful of a human he was? Well, it turns out that Archbishop, who was named Theodore, didn't have a good reputation himself. Or at least, not later on, because he was actually found years later to be involved in sexual abuse of children and adults, and found guilty of this and of abuse of power. And he was stripped of all of his titles. Now, in 2019, Robert's girlfriend at the time of all of this happening, the one who threw the condoms at him, she would actually come forward and tell her side of the story and her story from dating a killer. Well, before he was even a killer. She decided to talk to her friend, who also has a podcast. Her name is Heather McDonald, but this girlfriend's name is Alex Kapp. And she's actually now an actress doing well in Hollywood. And she would say that at 16 years old, she fell in love with a psychopath. She said he always had the inability to tell the truth, and she was also terrified of him getting out of prison when he finally did for her murder and finding her, so she wouldn't even put her home in her own name. She said that he was her first true love, but he didn't really treat her well. I mean, he didn't even take her on real dates. They would always just, meet up at a bar or whatever, but she felt that it was her true love. And he would also tell her tiny little lies for absolutely no reason. She said she felt crazy all the time because anytime she thought that he was acting a little bit off and would ask him about it, he would say she was the crazy one, ultimately gaslighting her. And she said he even once stole from her job at a pharmacy. Alex said that the night before this murder occurred, she was actually spending the night with him at her parents' empty apartment while they were out of town, and Robert left asking her for money for a cab, and all she had was $55 in cash. That's all her parents had given her. And she said, yeah, you can take the $5 bill. He said, okay. And then he took all the money and left. She called him and asked him, why'd you take all my money? And he said he didn't. Yet another lie. Now, the next day, Alex asked him to meet her at Dorian's because she wanted to talk to him about all of this happening. They'd been dating for quite a while, and she was done with all these lies. And so she met him at this bar, and she went with one of her Catholic friends. And the only reason I, mentioned that she's Catholic is because she had a boyfriend as well, Alex's friend, and she had just gone to Planned Parenthood to get some condoms for her and her boyfriend. And of course her parents weren't going to like this. So Alex was holding on to them for her. And so that's why she had this bag of condoms with her. And Alex was so angry because it took Robert hours longer than they had planned to get to this bar. And once he finally did, he just walked right past her. So she was so furious. When she first walked up to Robert and started, confronting him, he said he didn't want to deal with it. He was having a horrible night because his little brother had just tried to commit suicide. And Alex was taken aback at first, and then she realized, you don't have a little brother. And she told him this, and he said, no, my little brother from the Little Brother, Big Brother program. And that's when Alex laughed at him, because she knew he would not be a part of this program. But after she threw the condoms at him and he was left there to be laughed at, she did call him later that night. She got an answering machine and she told him to meet her at her apartment the next day to kind of talk about everything, because she felt bad about it and she was still so in love with him that she didn't want to lose him. However, he wouldn't show up to speak to her because by then he would be in custody. She had no idea about this until her friend told her after reading a newspaper, and strangely enough, Alex knew Jennifer. They weren't close, but the night prior they had met at Dorian's, and Jennifer was so friendly and came up to her and actually gave her one of those friendship bracelets and just said that she could have it. They had no idea that they were dating the same boy or what he was capable of. The police, of course, talked to Alex quite a bit, and one of the things that she remembers very distinctively is that they asked her about his cat, if he could possibly be aggressive enough to claw him in the face, because that's what he was saying had happened to his face. And she said no, because he's declawed. And that's part of the reason they knew very quickly that he was lying. Alex actually continued to receive letters from Robert while he was in jail, but they were never about her or their love or anything at all, or not even an apology, or it was always just about the fact that he was innocent, always about him. And after he was released on bail, while awaiting trial, she actually went to visit him at his apartment. Now, she actually said she went to his room with the door shut. She saw a whole bunch of newspapers about this murder case under his desk. And she tried to joke around saying, I guess you got what you wanted. You're famous now. Because he always used to tell her that he wanted to be famous for some reason or another. She expected him to have some sort of, sad reaction to that. But instead, he smiled at her. Just a wide, emotionless smile, and she remembers getting extremely creeped out. Chill went down her spine, and she knew that he had killed her, and it was on purpose. She said that she tried to make small talk after that so she could get out of there without him knowing that she was on to him. She wouldn't even walk with her back towards him because she was afraid he was going to choke her from behind, so she walked facing him to the elevator. And she said that she believed every single moment, every single step, that he was going to kill her. But she did get away. She survived. And he tried to call her again at her apartment, but she actually ended up pretending to be her mom and told her to never call Alex again. And she was so stern about it, so angry. And thankfully, Robert never did. And that was the last time she heard from him. And that's the last time she ever wants to. But I just thought that was a crazy ending to the story, that this girl, she could have been in Jennifer's shoes, and she could have, there's a lot of what ifs in this case, but the biggest one is, what if nobody had to die? What if Robert never killed anyone? That's the ultimate what if that I wish could have happened. But I hope that we stop looking at victims in cases like this and thinking that they're the ones who should be blamed at all. But I won't say too much because I can get really riled up about this, and I'm sure you guys don't want to hear all that. But, I do want to, hear your opinions or your stories if anything like this has happened to you and you feel comfortable sharing it. This is a safe space on my channel, and I do hope that everyone, respects each other in the comments, and you can tell your stories and just, rant if you want to. So yeah, just know that you are so incredibly strong. You are not the reason for anything happening to you. You did not deserve it, regardless of anything, regardless of who didn't believe you, of who says you could have done something different. You didn't deserve it. And that's that, period. So don't ever forget to speak up. Your voice is powerful enough, and I love you to absolute pieces. Okay? Bye.
Bye.